put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Invisible Pipeline. In the winter of 2024, a forensic blockchain analyst discovered something impossible. Deep within the transaction logs of a mid-sized cryptocurrency exchange, funds were moving in patterns that shouldn't exist. Millions of dollars flowing through addresses flagged by international law enforcement, yet somehow bypassing every compliance checkpoint designed to stop them. The analyst traced one wallet backward through 17 different exchanges across 9 countries. Each hop was perfectly legal. Each exchange had passed its regulatory audit. Yet the money, originally stolen from a ransomware attack on a hospital network, had become completely, mathematically, untraceable. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as someone designed it to. And what this analyst uncovered was just the surface of a financial architecture that turns dirty money into clean wealth at a scale that would make traditional money launderers weep with envy. This is the dark business story of how decentralized finance became the greatest money laundering system ever built. Not through criminal genius, but through the calculated exploitation of regulatory blind spots that governments still refuse to close. The promise of cryptocurrency was beautiful in its simplicity. A transparent, immutable ledger where every transaction lives forever in plain sight. Proponents said this would make financial crime impossible. How could you launder money when every movement was permanently recorded on a public blockchain? What they didn't anticipate was that transparency without enforcement is just theater. And in 2025, despite years of regulations, compliance frameworks, and international task forces, the crypto industry is moving more illicit funds than at any point in its history. The numbers tell a story that the industry desperately wants to bury. According to Chainalysis, a blockchain intelligence firm, cryptocurrency-based money laundering reached $27.4 billion in 2024, a 15% increase from the previous year. But here's what makes this figure truly chilling. That's only the traceable portion. The actual number, accounting for mixers, privacy coins, and decentralized exchanges operating entirely outside regulatory frameworks, is estimated by former FBI cyber investigators to be closer to $85 billion annually. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of countries like Ecuador or Kenya. Enough money to fund a small war or destabilize an entire region's economy. And it's all happening in plain sight, protected by a web of legal loopholes, jurisdictional confusion, and something far more sinister, the deliberate architecture of compliance failure. The modern crypto money laundering network doesn't look like the shadowy operations of old. There are no suitcases of cash, no corrupt bank managers, no offshore shell companies with anonymous owners. Instead, it operates through a sophisticated ecosystem of legitimate-seeming businesses, each playing a specific role in a financial disappearing act that would make Houdini jealous. At the center of this ecosystem are the exchanges, the platforms where cryptocurrency meets traditional money, where digital becomes physical, where traceable becomes anonymous. Take the case of Bitslato, a Hong Kong-registered exchange that operated openly until January 2024, when US and European authorities finally shut it down in a coordinated raid. For 5 years, Bitslato processed over $700 million in transactions from Hydra Market, Russia's largest darknet marketplace, a digital bazaar where you could buy anything from stolen credit cards to military-grade weapons to human trafficking services. Bitslato's founder, Anatoly Lekodimov, didn't hide his operation in some digital underground. He registered the company properly. He had a professional website. He even hired a compliance officer. But here's the sinister genius of the operation: that compliance officers' entire job was to ensure the company technically followed the letter of regulations while completely violating their spirit. Know your customer requirements? Satisfied by accepting obviously fake identification documents. Transaction monitoring, implemented with thresholds so high they'd never trigger. Suspicious activity reports, filed in a jurisdiction with no extradition treaty and no appetite for enforcement. Internal messages recovered by investigators revealed the true business model. When a compliance staff member flagged a series of obvious ransomware payments, Legkodimov's response was chilling in its casualness. "We are not police. Let them work." He understood something that regulators still struggle to accept. In the fragmented world of crypto regulation, you can be simultaneously legal and criminal, compliant and corrupt. You just need to know which jurisdictions ask which questions. But Bitslato was small-time compared to what was happening at the infrastructure level of crypto finance. The real innovation in money laundering came from understanding how decentralized finance, DeFi, created regulatory black holes that existing laws simply couldn't touch. Traditional money laundering requires placement, layering, and integration, 3 stages that banking regulations are designed to detect. You can't just deposit $10 million in drug money into a bank account without triggering immediate investigation. But in DeFi, those 3 stages collapse into a single transaction that happens in seconds across protocols that have no compliance officers, no corporate headquarters, and legally speaking, no operators who can be held accountable. Consider the mechanics of a modern crypto laundering operation, as described by a former exchange security chief who spoke to investigators on condition of anonymity. Criminal funds, let's say $5 million stolen in a corporate email compromise scam, enter the ecosystem through a compromised exchange account opened with stolen identity documents. The funds immediately move to a decentralized exchange, or DEX, where they're swapped for privacy coins like Monero. Monero transactions are cryptographically untraceable, designed specifically to break the blockchain's transparency. The funds then move through a series of mixing services, which combine them with thousands of other transactions, making source tracking mathematically impossible. But here's where it gets truly sophisticated. The funds don't return to a centralized exchange immediately. That would create a detectable pattern. Instead, they're parked in DeFi lending protocols where they earn interest while waiting. These protocols, of compound curve, are governed by smart contracts, not companies. They have no compliance departments because legally there's no they to regulate. The code is the company, and code doesn't file suspicious activity reports. After weeks or months of aging the funds through multiple protocols, they're gradually converted back to Bitcoin or Ethereum through peer-to-peer exchanges that operate entirely outside traditional financial infrastructure. Finally, they enter the traditional banking system through cryptocurrency ATMs in countries with minimal oversight, often in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia, where they're withdrawn as cash in amounts small enough to avoid reporting thresholds. The entire journey, from stolen funds to clean cash, takes about 45 days and costs roughly 12% in fees. For a $5 million heist, that's $600,000 in fees to make $4.4 million completely untraceable. For criminal organizations, that's a bargain compared to traditional laundering methods, which could cost 40% or more and take years to complete. But the most disturbing aspect of this system isn't the technology, it's the willful blindness baked into the industry's culture. First rehook, 30%. In late 2024, internal documents leaked from 3 major cryptocurrency exchanges revealed something that shook the few remaining true believers in crypto's legitimacy. The companies weren't just failing at compliance, They were actively designing their systems to facilitate compliance failure, while maintaining plausible deniability. The documents, which came to be known as the Ghost Protocol leaks, showed internal communications where executives discussed client retention strategies that were transparently about keeping high-volume accounts that regulators would immediately flag as suspicious. One exchange created a classification system for users: green for legitimate retail customers, yellow for high-frequency traders with unclear fund sources, and red for accounts showing obvious money laundering patterns. The green accounts generated minimal fees. The yellow accounts were monitored loosely. The red accounts, which represented less than 3% of users but over 40% of trading volume, were designated VIP and assigned dedicated account managers who provided technical support for moving funds in ways that would avoid automated detection systems. One leaked email from an exchange's head of VIP services was especially revealing. If we lose the red accounts to competitors, we lose the Q4 bonus pool. The regulators haven't actually shut anyone down for this yet. They just issue fines, which we can price into our business model. Our legal counsel confirms we're technically compliant as long as we file the SAR reports, even if we keep serving the clients afterward. The question isn't whether this is ethical. The question is whether the fine multiplied by the probability of enforcement exceeds the revenue from these accounts. So far, the math favors keeping them. This wasn't rogue behavior by a few bad actors. This was the financial reality of crypto exchanges in a regulatory environment where enforcement was toothless and profits from criminal facilitation dwarfed any penalties. The Ghost Protocol leaks revealed that at least 7 major exchanges, including 2 that advertised themselves as the most compliant platforms in crypto, operated similar systems. They filed the required reports to avoid criminal liability, then ignored their own findings and continued serving the accounts they'd just reported as suspicious. The regulatory response to these revelations was exactly what the exchanges had calculated. Strongly worded press releases, modest fines that represented a fraction of the illicit transaction revenue, and no criminal charges against any executives. The message was clear. Compliance theater was sufficient, as long as you maintained the paperwork that created legal cover. But the Ghost Protocol was just the mechanism. To understand why it exists, you have to follow the money backward to its sources, and this is where the story enters truly dark territory. According to a 2024 report by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the cryptocurrency laundering ecosystem now serves as critical financial infrastructure for North Korean weapons programs, which have generated an estimated $3 billion through crypto-based theft and laundering since 2017. International human trafficking networks, which use crypto for payments that traditional banking would immediately flag. Ransomware operations that have paralyzed hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure across 140 countries. And organized crime syndicates that have essentially replaced traditional money laundering with crypto-based systems that are faster, cheaper, and virtually immune to prosecution. The human cost of this system is almost impossible to calculate, but specific cases provide glimpses into the darkness. In 2023, a ransomware attack on a hospital network in Alabama forced the facility to divert emergency patients for 8 days. During that window, a pregnant woman in labor was diverted to a hospital 45 minutes away. She and her baby died in complications that doctors later testified would likely have been preventable with immediate care. The ransomware payment, $1.2 million in Bitcoin, was traced through 17 different exchanges before disappearing into a DeFi mixing protocol. Not a single exchange in that chain flagged the transaction as suspicious, despite the wallet address being publicly identified in law enforcement bulletins. When investigators finally tracked down the criminal operation, a group based in Eastern Europe, They found the laundered funds had been used to finance additional ransomware infrastructure, which went on to attack another 30 hospitals across the United States and Europe. The crypto exchanges that processed those transactions faced no legal consequences. Some of them actually highlighted their privacy-focused features in marketing materials targeted at customers seeking financial freedom from government surveillance. This is the business model. Profit from providing the infrastructure that enables crime, while legally insulating yourself through jurisdictional arbitrage and compliance theater that satisfies the letter of the law while violating every conceivable moral principle. The regulatory failures that enable this system aren't accidental. They're structural, built into the fundamental mismatch between 20th century financial law and 21st century digital money. Traditional anti-money laundering regulations assume a world of banks with headquarters, executives, and licenses that can be revoked. But DeFi protocols are lines of code deployed anonymously on decentralized networks. They have no CEO to arrest, no office to raid, no corporate charter to revoke. They're designed to be uncensorable and unstoppable, features celebrated by crypto advocates as liberation from government control, but functionally indistinguishable from perfect criminal infrastructure. And when regulators do attempt enforcement, they face a maze of jurisdictional questions that make effective action nearly impossible. If an exchange is registered in Malta, operates servers in Singapore, has executives in Dubai, and serves customers globally, which country has authority to investigate? If a DeFi protocol was coded by anonymous developers, deployed from a jurisdiction with no extradition treaty, and operates on a blockchain with nodes in 170 countries, who exactly do you prosecute? The industry's response to these questions has been to insist that regulation is impossible without breaking the fundamental features that make cryptocurrency valuable. They're not entirely wrong. Meaningful enforcement would require international coordination on a scale that has never been achieved for financial regulation. But what they don't say is that this impossibility is precisely the business model. Regulatory arbitrage isn't a bug in the crypto financial system. It's the core feature that makes it more profitable than traditional finance. Second rehook, 65%. But in early 2025, something unexpected happened that revealed just how deep the corruption runs. A whistleblower from inside Binance, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, released internal documents showing that the company had maintained a secret VIP sanctions bypass program that specifically helped users in sanctioned countries move money in ways that evaded international banking restrictions. The documents detailed a shadow compliance system that operated alongside Binance's official Know Your Customer processes. Certain high-value accounts, particularly those from Iran, Russia, and North Korea, were flagged internally not for restriction, but for special handling. Customer support representatives received training on how to guide these users through technical steps that would mask their true location and fund sources. The training materials explicitly acknowledged that these techniques were designed to circumvent sanctions, but framed them as protecting user privacy from government overreach. One internal Slack message from a Binance compliance director was particularly damning. We all know what these accounts are doing. We also know that if we shut them down, they'll just go to a shadier exchange where we have zero visibility. At least if they're on our platform, intelligence agencies can subpoena the data if they really need it. We're actually helping law enforcement by keeping these users visible, even if we're technically violating sanctions to do it. It's a gray area, but the alternative is worse. This rationalization, that facilitating crime provides visibility that aids investigation, became a common defense as the scandal widened. But internal emails between Binance executives told a different story. These accounts generated over $8 billion in trading volume annually, producing an estimated $400 million in fee revenue for Binance. The company had built financial projections that explicitly included sanctions-adjacent markets as a growth category. This wasn't passive facilitation. It was active business development of criminal infrastructure, dressed up in libertarian ideology about financial freedom. The leak triggered investigations in 14 countries and billions in regulatory fines. Binance's CEO, Changpeng Zhao, eventually pleaded guilty to anti-money laundering violations in U.S. court and agreed to step down, with the company paying $4.3 billion in penalties, the largest corporate fine in Department of Justice history. But even as Zhao accepted a 4-month prison sentence, Binance continued operating with barely a disruption to its business. The exchange's daily trading volume actually increased during the scandal, as users apparently viewed the regulatory attention as proof of Binance's importance rather than its criminality. And here's the truly chilling part. Binance wasn't an outlier. It was just the one that got caught. Former employees from Coinbase, Kraken, and other major exchanges have since come forward describing similar internal conflicts between compliance teams who wanted to enforce rules and growth teams whose bonuses depended on keeping high-volume accounts active, regardless of their source. The pattern is consistent across the industry. Compliance exists as legal cover, not functional control. The Binance case also revealed the most sophisticated layer of the money laundering ecosystem, the role of mainstream financial institutions in providing the final conversion point where crypto becomes traditional money. For all the talk of decentralization, cryptocurrency ultimately needs connection points to the traditional banking system. You can't pay rent in Bitcoin. You can't buy a yacht with Ethereum. At some point, digital has to become physical. Crypto has to become fiat, and that requires banks. Court documents from the Binance investigation revealed that several major international banks had maintained correspondent banking relationships with crypto exchanges despite clear evidence of massive money laundering activity. These banks, household names in traditional finance, processed billions in wire transfers from exchanges that their own compliance departments had internally flagged as high risk for sanctions violations and money laundering. But like the exchanges themselves, the banks made a calculated decision. The fees from processing these transactions exceeded the expected cost of regulatory penalties, even after accounting for the reputational risk. This is how mature the money laundering infrastructure has become. It's not operating in shadows, it's operating in spreadsheets, where risk managers assign probability distributions to enforcement actions and price criminal facilitation as a line item in revenue forecasting. The business lesson here is as dark as it is clear. In systems where enforcement is probabilistic rather than certain, crime becomes a pricing problem. If the expected fine is lower than the revenue from illicit activity, rational profit-maximizing actors will choose to break the law. The crypto industry didn't invent this calculation. Pharmaceutical companies have been doing it with drug safety for decades, and banks did it with mortgage fraud before 2008. But crypto industrialized it, automated it, and scaled it to a level that previous financial crimes couldn't approach. So where does this leave us in 2025? Despite international task forces, enhanced regulations, and billions in fines, the money laundering ecosystem continues growing. New DeFi protocols launch daily, each promising greater privacy and less regulatory friction. Exchanges continue serving high-risk customers while filing perfunctory compliance reports that everyone knows are theater. And the regulatory apparatus remains fragmented, underfunded, and structurally unable to address crimes that operate at the speed of software across jurisdictions that can't coordinate enforcement. Some industry observers predict that artificial intelligence will eventually solve the problem, that machine learning systems will become sophisticated enough to detect laundering patterns that humans can't spot. But this misses the fundamental issue. The problem isn't detection, it's enforcement. We already know which exchanges are processing criminal funds. We know which protocols are designed specifically for money laundering. We know which banks are providing the connection points to traditional finance. The question isn't intelligence. It's whether anyone with the power to act is willing to accept the economic and political costs of actually shutting the system down. Because here's what nobody wants to say out loud. If you actually enforced money laundering laws in crypto with the same rigor applied to traditional banking, the entire industry would collapse. Trading volumes would plummet. Exchanges would become unprofitable. DeFi would become unusable for most of its current applications. The industry exists in its current form specifically because it operates in regulatory gray zones that traditional finance cannot access. And this creates a perverse political economy. The industry has become large enough that its collapse would have real economic consequences: job losses, investment losses, tax revenue losses. Politicians who push for serious enforcement risk backlash from an industry that spent over $120 million on lobbying in the United States alone in 2024. Regulators who were too aggressive find themselves facing industry-funded lawsuits and political pressure to back down. The system has grown too big to regulate without breaking, which means it's effectively too big to regulate at all. This is regulatory capture in its purest form, not through corruption or conspiracy, but through the simple mathematics of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. The crypto industry reaps billions in profits from regulatory arbitrage. The victims of money laundering, ransomware victims, trafficking survivors, citizens of sanctioned states whose governments use crypto to evade accountability, bear individual costs too small to organize political resistance. The system continues because those who profit from it have more power than those who suffer from it. But perhaps the darkest aspect of this entire story is that it's not actually a story about technology at all. The blockchain, the cryptography, the decentralization, these are just tools. The real story is about what happens when you build financial systems explicitly designed to evade accountability, then act surprised when they attract actors who value unaccountability above all else. Crypto promised to liberate finance from corrupt institutions and government overreach. What it actually built was a system that makes traditional financial crime look quaint by comparison. A turnkey money laundering infrastructure that serves dictators, traffickers, and terrorists with the same efficiency it serves libertarians and tech entrepreneurs. The forensic analyst who discovered those impossible transactions in that winter of 2024 eventually left the industry entirely. In their final report before resignation, they wrote something that haunts anyone who's looked deeply into this system. I got into blockchain analysis because I believed the propaganda that transparency would make financial crime obsolete. What I learned is that transparency without enforcement is just documentation of crimes that nobody will be punished for. We've built a perfect system for watching money get laundered in real time, then doing nothing about it. The criminals aren't hiding in the shadows anymore. They're operating in the light because they've correctly calculated that the light doesn't matter if nobody's willing to act on what it reveals. And that calculation, that perfect, cynical, mathematically correct assessment of how regulation actually works when profit incentives outweigh enforcement capacity, is perhaps the real innovation of crypto finance. Not the technology, but the insight that in a globalized world with fragmented law enforcement, you can commit crimes in public as long as you make them complicated enough that responsibility becomes impossible to assign. As 2025 progresses, new regulations are being proposed, new enforcement actions are being planned, and new compliance frameworks are being designed. But if the past is any guide, they'll follow the same pattern. Enough action to create headlines, not enough to threaten the business model. The exchanges will pay their fines, the protocols will launch in new jurisdictions, and the money, billions and billions in criminal proceeds, will continue flowing through a system that everyone knows is broken but nobody with power is willing to fix. Because fixing it would require asking a question that goes beyond crypto, beyond finance, beyond technology. A question about what kind of economy we're willing to accept, and what price we're willing to pay for the wealth it generates. And in the darkness of that question lies an answer that most people aren't ready to confront. That we've built a global financial system that doesn't just tolerate crime as an unfortunate side effect, but depends on it as a structural feature. The money keeps moving, the algorithms keep running, and somewhere, right now, in the cold mathematics of a blockchain ledger, another impossible transaction is completing its journey, from crime scene to clean account, visible the entire time, untouchable until the end. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.